Well, good morning, everyone. And today I'm joined by Professor Shareen Joshi, who is Associate Professor in our School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. And Shareen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. You have been a part of our community for over a decade, and I'm grateful to have this time together to engage your insights and your research. So let's get started. As a microeconomist, your research has focused on long-term impacts of various social and economic programs. And you've looked in particular at how investing in women has social and economic benefits to a society. Can you share a bit about how you arrived at this focus in your research and why you think economics is a powerful tool for understanding these sorts of impacts?
Sure. So firstly, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's an honor and a pleasure to have this conversation, especially in the middle of the times we are in. Thank you. Um, to answer your question, my path has been quite nonlinear. There have been so many twists and turns that there are honestly some days where I wake up and I feel like I'm living in someone else's life. My story, my roots are in a small town in India. I grew up in an era of state-owned enterprises, government control, and widespread poverty. The state of Rajasthan and Jaipur, where I'm from, was a very gendered society when I was growing up. Being in a co-ed school was a fashionable new thing, and in my classroom, most of my childhood, there were 3 girls and 35 boys. So but even over there, I would say I was very fortunate. I was always given the message that I could be anyone I wanted to as long as I worked hard and studied. So I came to this country at the age of 18 on a scholarship to Reed College. I was seeking a liberal arts education and I studied economics largely because I thought that it had some answers to it had solutions for poverty and inequality that kind of haunted me most of my life. Now, textbook economics turned out to actually not have very many answers. Economic models have very rational actors who are very individualistic, very self interested, and markets kind of work for them. And the questions I was wrestling with just didn't seem answerable with those tools. So, credit to Reed College, they allowed me to stay within economics and approach it through the lens of critiques and methodological innovation. I became a researcher very early. I really was part of, there were leaps of computing power. There was a real data revolution happening at the time. I was lucky to be studying at a time when so much was possible. And I think I learned that when you leave textbook economics and you enter into the world of tools and resources to work with data, economics has lots to offer. So I learned to collect with data, work with data, interpret data, and let data be my guide. I stayed very much rooted to kind of the context in which I grew up. I eventually found an intellectual home in development economics. I combined economics with a sort of area studies focus. And Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service, has been a wonderful place to kind of, embrace that interdisciplinarity. So that's how I ended up there. It still feels like someone else's life on some days, 3 continents and a world away from India, but that's the nonlinear path.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I know you've recently looked at women's collectives in India as one example of a program that can have long-term economic impacts. Can you tell us about the research that you did for that project and what you've learned about the impact of collective action?
Yeah, that project was a real adventure. I had the opportunity to do firsthand field work in remote villages of Rajasthan. I also had the opportunity to kind of design surveys, analyze big data, and advise governments on poverty alleviation programs in those very villages and beyond. So the before I, bore you with kind of details of the program and the research, I was wondering, which part of this would be of interest to you, the program, the field work, or the data analysis, or more?
Well, I think learning more about the program and the field work, I can maybe hold off on the data right now.
Yeah, so the program was a really ambitious one. It was 2013. The government of India, in partnership with the World Bank, was attempting to organize 350 million women in India, in rural areas of India, into self-help groups. Self-help groups are basically groups of women convened by a facilitator who typically comes either from the government or an NGO, and is typically a local woman with some education. They're convened by a facilitator. To women form groups of somewhere between 10 and 15. They meet weekly. They contribute a very modest sum of money to a collective box. It's literally an actual box. Um, and that becomes a communal savings box, which then becomes a source of loans for needy members of the group. So they interloan money. The records are eventually turned over to a bank. The government grades their performance and offers them loans to scale up micro enterprises. So that's the program we were attempting to study. So it's intensely local at some level, and yet it has all the markings of a kind of financial, poverty alleviation project.
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you. That's terrific. Now, in addition to your academic work, you've served as a consultant for the World Bank, the United Nations, the government of India, among several others. Can you share more about what it's like to apply your research work to what's taking place on the global stage?
Yeah, sure. I've been very honored to be able to work with, entities like the government of India and the United Nations and the World Bank. But one conflict I've often had is when I'm sitting at those very big tables in big buildings, in places, in rooms that are so far removed from the villages and the communities where I've actually spent time. I feel this heightened awareness of a gulf between the people making policy and the people who those policies are designed for. So, this goes to back to your previous question of, when I was doing field work in India, one thing I learned very quickly is large organizations like the government of India or the World Bank rely heavily on data, right? Like, for example, for self-help groups, the data are financial metrics. What percentage of women saved? What percentage of women took loans? When they were given a bigger loan, how was their repayment? Those metrics were actually the easy part, right? But when I was doing field work, what I actually saw was every group was different. Even two groups that have roughly the same financial indicators could be entirely different groups in terms of their composition, the lived experiences of the women in those groups, and the agency they had in their communities. So I saw groups where women were quite empowered. They were ambitious women. They were using the self-help group as a platform to do the things they had always wanted to do, like fix village water supply. Who knew self-help groups end up making a difference on water supply? But there were other villages, right? And other groups. Sometimes it was another group in the same village where the women were not mobilized in a similar way. And oftentimes you'd have husbands sitting on the side or mothers-in-law, telling the facilitator, why are you inviting my daughter-in-law or my wife to this group? She really needs to go home and take care of her children. And I encountered, there was one group where the woman who was actually the self-help group member wasn't even allowed into the room. Her husband went into the room and did all the negotiations for her. So the conflict I feel when working in, the world of big international multilateral organizations and government organizations and advising them is, how do I do justice to the lived experiences I have borne witness to on the ground and the story that is told by data?
Sure.
And I don't really have a good solution to this. The question has haunted me for a long time. But what I've learned as a scholar is to take that stress and that anxiety and channel it into better research, right? So, I would say that what I strive for is to understand that data can tell powerful stories, but data has its limits. And it is really important to know where data comes from and how to interpret it. And sometimes when you're sitting on those tables, you do have to kind of back down from the exciting graph and the exciting interpretation of the line on the graph and put caveats, and those frustrate everybody. But taking that back into my scholarship and saying, well, can I make a better graph that tells a more nuanced story? That's the struggle I find myself in all the time, and it's a big conflict that I go through. So you feel really excited to be part of those conversations, but a real responsibility, and sometimes the two don't fully align.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, you've taught some terrific courses over your years at Georgetown. What are some of your favorites?
Oh gosh, I have too many favorites, I would say. I'd say, okay, maybe I'll pick three favorites.
Okay.
My very favorite among the favorites is probably my first year freshman pro seminar. I teach a class called The Story of India, Economics, Fiction, and Film. So I tell, as an economist with an area studies focus, I go through the kind of history of India's development trajectory. We talk about colonialism, we talk about the freedom struggle, the economic dimensions of that, the Indian economy after it became an independent country, and the different experiments with, mixed economy versus globalization. And that we supplement the data, with lived experience, so perspectives from literature, perspectives from film. And there really I've had the good fortune of Georgetown's openness to creative syllabi designed to be able to draw in writers, filmmakers, very much from India. So again, that tension between data and context, I'm able to bring into the classroom and show my students very early in their time at Georgetown. So that's one favorite. The second favorite class is again an undergraduate class. It's a research class. As an undergraduate at Reed College, I felt this enormous urge to do research early on. And, my dissatisfaction with economics and yet my desire to remain as an econ major was resolved by being able to do research. And I really want more Georgetown students to have that experience. Go study something ridiculous, go study something that you have never seen studied before, that you think is really important, and study it. Find the limits of the existing tools, come up with your own ideas. And working with students to go through that process is life changing and rewarding on both sides. So again, I think it's the wonderful way we structure the Georgetown curriculum that allows this. That is truly one of my favorite classes. And the last one I would say is the very bread and butter introduction to the economics and politics of development class, where you talk about development, the micro, the macro, the data, the lived experience, all in the context of one class for the developing world. So it's development economics and more. Those are all my favorite classes at Georgetown.
Those are terrific, just terrific. Now, you've also participated in our Doyle Faculty Fellows Program, which supports a cohort of our faculty members each year in redesigning one of their courses to more fully incorporate themes of diversity and difference. Can you tell us about your experience as a Doyle Fellow?
Oh, it was a wonderful chapter of my time at Georgetown. Just being able to meet every week with colleagues from across campus and talk about pedagogy was a delightful experience for me. I made new friends. I learned so much from my cohort. I think the way that program is structured, where faculty from different parts of campus work together as a cohort over a whole year to advise each other on their projects, was a really powerful experience for me. The project I worked on in that over that year was really how to invigorate my research class. That class had a theme of studying gender inequality. Now, I've had other iterations of it where we study social exclusion, or social inclusion, I should say, because the idea is to think of creative ways to reduce exclusion. But the class was structured to have a broad theme, and students would do research projects connected to that theme. That gave me as a chance as a professor to really teach some anchor papers, ideas that would become part of kind of everybody's lit review or general advice on how to work with data, how to interpret data, the limits of data. And then, so it gave me a chance to anchor down on some themes that were for everybody, and then also allow students to do individual projects. And the challenge we had in that class is really pushing students to the limits of creativity under the banner, under the umbrella of gender inequality. What are the questions? What are the awkward, uncomfortable, difficult questions that aren't talked about in other classes that are weighing on the students? So the Doyle Fellowship was a beautiful experience, because what I learned to do was how to break down barriers and have difficult conversations with students about what topics to study and how to study them, even when they were drawn from their personal experience, their personal lives. So when I've taught this on the issue of social inclusion, difficult conversations about not just gender, but race, ethnicity, class, caste. I had one student do a research project on the caste system of rural Bihar in India. And that how do you get students to fully recognize that the urge to do research does come from personal lived experience, but in academia you have to take that and anchor in it, but also apply methods and learn methods that are kind of at the methodological frontier of a discipline. So how do you do that without offending, without hurting, without, stepping on toes and pushing boundaries? Those are techniques me and my cohort taught each other. And in some sense, we were ahead of our time, because there's a lot more of that that's happening at Georgetown right now, but it definitely made me a student of these issues for the long term.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being here today and sharing your reflections. Uh, is there any last words you'd like to leave with the members of our community?
Yes, we're in a tough moment, aren't we, right now? I was, trying to think about all that we've endured in the past year with the lockdown and the summer of so much social upheaval, not just in the US, but in many parts of the world right now. And everything feels upside down. The life I was living last year feels like a long time ago. So earlier in this hour, we were talking about collectives and we were talking about connectedness, those women's self-help groups and bottom up participation and how powerful that can be in a society. I think where I've ended up in life is thinking about how the magic of progress occurs when bottom up meets top down, right? Like when leadership from the top supports processes at the bottom. And I feel like we're living in a time where there's a real clamoring for that in the societies in which we are living. So the message I would have is that struggle is a worthy struggle. Let's keep at it. I would say that we are all at our best when we're connected. Right now, we're all socially distancing, but striving to connect. I think it was what Mother Teresa who once said, if we don't feel like we're at peace, it's probably because we've forgotten we belong to each other.
Yeah.
So both when I think about liberal arts education and classrooms and research classes and my pro seminar, or I'm thinking about collectives in Rajasthan, for me, it's that human experience, that connectedness, and I'm finding it a struggle to keep it. But I guess my message to everybody is let's keep struggling to keep it because we can't lose that fight.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for sharing these reflections with us all today. It's been just a joy to be able to spend this time together with you. And thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to being with you all again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.